When my son got married, I said nothing about the $19 million in penthouse villas my husband left me. The bride's father clinked his glass for speeches. I touched the folded papers in my purse, property deeds, bank statements, email printouts that proved every word David was about to say was carefully crafted fiction. For 3 years, I'd let him play the family hero while I lived in a small Charlotte apartment, but tonight felt different. Tonight I carried proof. Have you ever smiled through your worst betrayal because speaking up would destroy someone else's moment? Hi viewers, kindly tell us where you're watching from and what time it is. Warm welcome to the family, enjoy the story. When the champagne glasses clinked at her only son's wedding in Miami, Claire stood quietly at the back of the ballroom. Everyone toasted the new couple, but nobody knew the secret that had been pressing against her chest for 3 years. Her late husband, Mark, had left her a portfolio of penthouse villas worth nearly $19 million scattered across Florida and Nevada. The will was airtight, signed in Palm Beach just months before he passed, but her husband's brother, a polished attorney from Atlanta who wore confidence like a weapon, had quietly filed amendments after the funeral. He used corrective paperwork and a missing signature page to edge her name out. By the time the wedding rolled around, those villas weren't listed in her name anymore. On paper, she had been erased. And she said nothing. What her son and his new wife didn't see was how Claire had spent nights tracing old emails, bank drafts, and property deeds by herself, building a silent record that proved her husband's intentions. She carried copies of property tax notices folded into her clutch bag that very evening, as if keeping them close might keep her standing. To the family, she looked like a proud mother enjoying a new beginning. Inside, she was measuring every smile against the silence she had chosen. She knew the fight wasn't about money, it was about not letting someone with power turn her life into a blank page. And even though she hadn't spoken yet, her silence wasn't surrender. It was strategy. Have you ever smiled through your worst betrayal because speaking up would destroy someone else's moment? What Claire discovered next would test every belief about family loyalty and force her to choose between keeping peace and keeping what was rightfully hers. If you've ever wondered how far someone would go to steal millions from a grieving widow, this story will leave you questioning everyone you trust. Follow along as we uncover a betrayal that took 3 years to plan and 1 moment of courage to expose. The champagne glass trembled in my hand as my son kissed his bride. Everyone cheered. I counted the zeros on the tax notice folded in my clutch, $19 million that no longer had my name. David stood near the wedding cake, his silver hair catching the ballroom lights as he told stories about Mark to anyone who'd listen. My brother-in-law had always been smooth with words, the kind of man who could make you feel grateful for things he'd stolen from you. Tonight he wore the same navy suit he'd worn to Mark's funeral, the same concerned expression he'd used when he offered to handle the legal complications, while I grieved. Have you ever felt your whole life balance on staying quiet? The bride's father clinked his glass for speeches. I touched the folded papers in my purse, property deeds, bank statements, email printouts that proved every word David was about to say was carefully crafted fiction. For 3 years, I'd let him play the family hero while I lived in a small Charlotte apartment, but tonight felt different. Tonight I carried proof. Do you know someone who's ever been erased from their own story while everyone watched? David stepped forward, raising his glass high. Mark would be so proud to see his son starting this new chapter. And I know he'd want all of us to remember that family takes care of family. His eyes found mine across the room. Mark always said the Morrison legacy was about protecting the people we love, no matter what it costs us personally. The room murmured agreement. I felt the Nevada property tax notice crinkle against my ribs. David had no idea that Mark had written my name in permanent ink on every deed, every transfer, every legal document that mattered. The corrective paperwork David filed after the funeral had one fatal flaw. Mark's real signature looked nothing like the practiced forgery David had submitted to the Florida courts. The problem was simple. David thought grief made me stupid. He was wrong. I watched my son beam at his uncle's words, and my chest tightened. In 10 minutes, this reception would end. Tomorrow, David would go back to his Atlanta office and continue managing properties that belonged to me. The rental income from those villas had been paying for his children's private school while I clipped grocery coupons. But what if I told you that 3 years of silence wasn't surrender, it was preparation? The speeches ended. Guests moved toward the dance floor. David approached me with that concerned smile that used to make me feel protected but now made my skin crawl. "Claire, you look beautiful tonight. Mark would be so happy to see his son settled." He squeezed my shoulder. "And don't worry about anything else. I'm still handling all those complicated estate matters for you." I nodded and smiled back. "Thank you, David. You've been so thorough. If staying quiet cost you millions, would you speak? Subscribe. Some silences are more dangerous than screams." He relaxed, satisfied that the grieving widow still trusted him completely. As he walked away to charm more relatives, I pulled out my phone and sent a single text message: "Janet, it's time. File everything Monday morning." As David raised his glass to Mark's eternal legacy, I felt the property deed crinkle against my ribs. He had no idea I'd found the original. Comment evidence, if you'd have kept those papers hidden until the right moment. The moving boxes sat unopened for 2 months in my Charlotte apartment. Inside one of them was the life I used to have, and the proof of who stole it. I'd moved to North Carolina to disappear, not to hide. After Mark's funeral, when David started organizing the estate paperwork, I needed space to think without his concerned phone calls and surprise visits. The apartment was small, clean, nothing like the Naples penthouse where Mark and I had planned to grow old together. But it was mine, paid for with the life insurance David couldn't touch. The box marked Mark's office had been sitting by my kitchen table since December. Every time I walked past it, I felt the weight of everything I'd lost pressing down like a physical thing. Tonight, with snow hitting the windows and nowhere left to run from the truth, I finally cut the tape. Have you ever avoided opening something because you knew it would change everything? Mark's handwriting hit me first. Post-it notes stuck to file folders, margin comments on contracts, his careful way of writing numbers that made every 7 look like a tiny sword. I'd forgotten how his hand moved across paper, the way he dotted every I like he was making a promise. The Nevada property folder was thick, organized with the precision that made Mark successful. Property deeds, purchase agreements, rental contracts, all with my name listed as joint owner, then sole beneficiary after his death. But underneath the official papers, I found something David had missed. Mark's personal notes, written in pencil on yellow legal paper. "Claire gets everything. David knows nothing about Nevada properties. Keep separate from Florida holdings for tax purposes. If something happens to me, make sure David doesn't get involved. He's too aggressive with other people's money." The date made my hands shake. March 15th, 3 days before Mark's heart attack. Do you know someone whose final wishes were completely ignored by their own family? I kept digging through the box. Bank statements showing Mark had been transferring money into accounts David never knew existed. Insurance policies naming me as the only beneficiary. And at the bottom, wrapped in plastic like Mark was protecting it from flood or fire, was his personal safe combination written on the back of our wedding photo. The problem was clear: Mark had spent months protecting me from his own brother, and I'd handed David the keys anyway. The safe was still in storage, along with furniture I'd been too broken to sort through. But Mark's combination was right here in my hands, written in his careful script like a message from beyond death itself. I called the storage facility. They were open until 9. The drive through Charlotte felt like traveling between 2 different lives. In the rearview mirror was the woman who'd trusted David because grief made decision-making feel impossible. Ahead was whatever Mark had hidden so carefully that he'd written the combination on the back of our happiest day. The storage unit smelled like the cologne Mark wore on Sundays. His safe sat in the corner, smaller than I remembered but somehow more important now. I turned the dial slowly, hearing each number click into place: our anniversary, my birthday, the day we bought our first house together. The lock opened with a soft sound like an exhale. Inside were documents David had never seen. Original property contracts with my name typed, not handwritten. Insurance policies he'd never mentioned. And a sealed envelope marked, "Claire, if David gets involved, open immediately. What would you do with proof that someone lied to your face while you grieved? My phone buzzed. Text from David, hope you're settling in well. Still handling everything here. No need to worry about any business matters. I looked at the envelope in my hands, then at his text message. Mark's handwriting on the envelope was clear. Claire gets everything. David knows nothing about Nevada. Dated 3 days before he died. Ever found evidence that your worst suspicions were actually too kind? The bank statements didn't lie. Transfers to David's account started the week Mark was buried, before the will was even read. I spread the documents across my kitchen table like pieces of a puzzle that spelled out betrayal. Mark's business checking account showed electronic transfers to Morrison Legal Services, David's firm, starting 5 days after the funeral. The amounts were careful, never large enough to trigger automatic reviews, but steady enough to drain serious money. $15,000 here. $22,000 there. Always on Fridays, always after business hours, always with reference numbers that meant nothing to anyone except the person who authorized them. Have you ever discovered someone was stealing from you in slow motion? But the bank records were just the beginning. The property tax notices told a different story than David's legal papers. According to Collier County, Florida, I was still the legal owner of the Naples Penthouse. According to Clark County, Nevada, the Las Vegas high-rise units were still registered under my Social Security number. The rental income was still being deposited into accounts with my name on them. David had been collecting that income for 3 years while telling me the properties were tied up in probate complications. The problem was becoming crystal clear. David was a thief with a law degree. I pulled out the corrective documents David had filed in probate court, the ones that supposedly fixed clerical errors in Mark's will. The signature looked like Mark's handwriting, but something felt wrong. I found our marriage certificate and laid it next to David's paperwork. Mark's real signature had a small flourish on the M and always connected the R to the K in Morrison. The signature on David's corrections was close, but the R stood alone, and the M was too careful, like someone had practiced it slowly. David had forged my dead husband's signature to steal $19 million from his own sister-in-law. The phone rang. David's number flashed on the screen. Claire, just checking in. How are you settling into Charlotte? I know the holidays can be tough. His voice carried that practiced concern that had fooled me for 3 years. I'm managing, David. Taking things one day at a time. Good, good. Listen, I got some paperwork from the Nevada properties. Looks like there might be some additional tax complications. Nothing for you to worry about, but I'll need to handle a few more filings. I stared at the bank statement showing his latest transfer, $38,000 taken the day before Thanksgiving. Of course, David. I trust your judgment completely. Perfect. Oh, and Claire? If you get any calls from property managers or tax offices, just forward them to me. These estate matters can get confusing, and I don't want you getting overwhelmed with technical details. Financial betrayal leaves digital footprints. Subscribe, learn to spot them before you're the victim. After I hung up, I photographed every document, every bank statement, every forged signature. Then I called a number I'd found online. Henderson and Associates, forensic accountants who specialized in estate fraud. The receptionist's voice was professional but warm. Mrs. Morrison, Mr. Henderson can see you Thursday morning. Please bring all original documents and any electronic records you have access to. I looked at the evidence spread across my table, then at David's latest text. Hope you're having a peaceful evening. Sleep well. The signature on the correction didn't match Mark's wedding certificate. Someone had practiced, but not enough. Drop forgery if you've spotted handwriting that didn't look right. Janet's voice cracked over the phone. Claire, I kept copies. David told me to shred them, but something felt wrong. Mark's former assistant had been trying to reach me for 6 months, but David had given her my old Naples number, not my Charlotte address. When she finally tracked me down through Mark's insurance company, her first words were an apology that broke my heart. I should have called you right after the funeral, but David said you were too fragile to handle business details. He said he was protecting you from stress. We met at a coffee shop near the Charlotte airport, neutral ground where David's Atlanta connections couldn't accidentally spot us. Janet looked older than I remembered, like carrying secrets had cost her sleep. She'd worked for Mark for 12 years, longer than David had been practicing law. Tag someone who'd risk their job to do the right thing. She slid a manila envelope across the small table between us. These are copies of the documents Mark gave me the week before he died. He said if anything happened to him, and if David tried to change anything, I should get these to you directly. Inside were property deeds with my name clearly listed as sole beneficiary. Not joint owner, sole beneficiary. Mark had been specific about that distinction, according to Janet's notes. There were also bank routing numbers for accounts David had never mentioned and rental agreements showing income that should have been coming to me for 3 years. David came to the office 2 days after the funeral, Janet continued, her voice dropping to nearly a whisper. He said Mark's will had drafting errors that needed correction. He had me pull all the Nevada files and make copies. Then he told me to shred the originals. Have you ever been told to destroy evidence and knew it was wrong? But Janet had worked for Mark long enough to know his handwriting, his organization system, his careful way of protecting the people he loved. The documents David wanted destroyed weren't errors, they were exactly what Mark intended. I made copies of everything before I shredded the originals. Then I made copies of the copies. Mark always said important papers should exist in 3 places: the office, the home, and somewhere safe. She pulled out a second envelope, thicker than the first. Bank statements going back 2 years. Mark was moving money into accounts David didn't know about. Look at the dates. The transfers had started 6 months before Mark died. Small amounts at first, then larger ones, always to accounts with my name only. It was like Mark had been quietly building me a financial safety net, sensing something I'd been too trusting to see. Do you know someone who protected you from dangers you didn't even know existed? Janet's phone buzzed. David's name flashed on the screen. She declined the call. He's been asking if I've heard from you. I told him no, but Claire, he's getting nervous about something. Last week he asked me if Mark ever mentioned Nevada properties to anyone outside the family. The truth was surfacing. David knew his theft had holes, and he was scrambling to plug them. I thanked Janet and watched her walk back to her car, this woman who'd risked her career to honor a dead man's wishes. In my purse, I now had 2 sets of documents, the ones David had filed in court, and the ones Mark had actually signed. The difference between them was $19 million and the truth about who my husband really trusted. Janet slid the envelope across the table. He made me watch him burn the copies. But I made copies of the copies. Ever gotten proof that changed everything? Share what you did with it below. The Las Vegas property manager's voice was confused. Ma'am, you're still listed as primary owner here. Should I not have sent the rental income to your account? I'd been staring at Janet's documents for 2 days before I found the courage to make the call. The Nevada properties were the piece of Mark's estate that David had been most secretive about, always claiming they were complicated by interstate tax issues whenever I asked. But Mark's notes were clear: 3 luxury condos in Las Vegas, 2 townhouses in Reno, all purchased as rental investments, all generating monthly income that should have been supporting me since his death. The property manager, Tom Chin, had been sending rental checks to a bank account I'd forgotten existed. One Mark had opened in my name only, using my maiden name to keep it separate from our joint accounts. Mrs. Patterson, I hope there's no confusion. Mr. Morrison was very specific about the ownership structure when he purchased these units. Your name is on all the primary documents. What detail would a thief most likely forget? Share your guess below. Tom's records showed rental income of $42,000 deposited into my account over the past 3 years. Money I'd never seen because the bank statements went to a P.O. box I'd never opened. David had been telling me the Nevada properties were still in legal limbo, while they generated enough income to support me comfortably. Ma'am, I did get some calls from a David Morrison claiming to represent the estate. He wanted me to redirect the rental payments to his firm's account, but the ownership documents don't support that request. I told him he'd need written authorization from you. My breath caught. What did he say? He seemed surprised that you were still the account holder. Said there must be paperwork delays and he'd get back to me. That was 8 months ago. Haven't heard from him since. Have you ever caught someone in a lie so big they forgot to cover all the angles? David had been stealing Florida rental income while the Nevada income kept flowing to me, proof that his theft was selective, calculated, and incomplete. He'd gotten greedy with the bigger properties and sloppy with the smaller ones. I asked Tom to email me 3 years of rental statements and tenant records. Then I called the Reno property manager. Same story, my name on the deeds, rental income flowing to my forgotten account, David making inquiries he had no legal right to make. The Reno manager, Patricia Williams, had even better news. Your husband was very smart about the tax structure here. These properties have been generating net income of about $18,000 per month after expenses. All legitimate, all documented, all yours. $18,000 per month. For 3 years. While David told me to live simply in my Charlotte apartment. One overlooked detail destroys perfect crimes. Subscribe, catch the mistakes others miss. I hung up and did the math. The Nevada properties alone had generated over $600,000 since Mark's death. David had stolen the Florida income but missed the Nevada income because Mark had been smarter than his brother gave him credit for. Mark had protected me even after death, and David's greed had blinded him to his own mistakes. I called Janet. I need the name of Mark's accountant. The one David didn't use for the estate filings. Harold Reeves. He's still in Naples. But Claire, he's been asking questions about the Nevada properties. David told him those were sold to cover debts. The pieces clicked together. David had lied to everyone, the courts, the accountant, the family, and me. But lies need maintenance, and David had been too arrogant to maintain his properly. Harold Reeves answered on the second ring. Mrs. Morrison, I've been hoping you'd call. Some of these estate filings don't match the records I have. The Reno property manager paused. Your husband was very specific about keeping David away from these accounts. What would you do with proof someone betrayed you worse than you thought? Tell me below. The forensic accountant's pen stopped moving. Mrs. Morrison, this isn't oversight. This is systematic theft disguised as estate management. Harold Henderson's office felt like a doctor's exam room, sterile, serious, designed for delivering news that would change everything. I'd brought 3 boxes of documents, Mark's original papers, David's court filings, and the bank records that proved the timeline of theft. Harold had been studying my case for 6 hours, his reading glasses sliding down his nose as he cross-referenced dates, signatures, and account numbers. When he finally looked up, his expression was grim. Your brother-in-law has been operating a sophisticated embezzlement scheme. He used his legal credentials to file fraudulent corrections, then redirected asset income to accounts he controls. The Nevada properties were his blind spot, he didn't know they existed. Have you ever learned that someone's betrayal was even worse than you imagined? Harold spread out a timeline he'd created, marking each theft with red ink. The transfers began immediately after the funeral, which suggests premeditation. He'd been planning this before your husband died. The room felt colder. David hadn't just taken advantage of my grief, he'd been waiting for Mark to die. The forged signatures are amateur work. Your husband's real handwriting has specific pressure patterns and letter connections that David couldn't replicate. Any handwriting expert would spot these as fraudulent within minutes. Harold pulled out a magnifying glass and showed me the differences. Mark's real M had a slight backward tilt. The forged M was perfectly vertical. Mark connected his R to his K in Morrison. The forgeries had a tiny gap between those letters. Do you know someone whose lies fell apart under close examination? Mrs. Morrison, you have enough evidence for both civil recovery and criminal prosecution. The question is how aggressively you want to pursue this. I thought about my son's wedding, about David's speech about family loyalty, about the concerned phone calls he'd made while stealing from me. What are my options? Civil suit for full asset recovery plus damages. Criminal charges for forgery and embezzlement. Or we can approach David's legal counsel directly and see if he wants to settle quietly before this becomes public. Harold leaned back in his chair. In my experience, men like David count on their victims staying quiet to avoid family drama. They use shame as a shield. The problem was that David had mistaken my silence for weakness instead of strategy. I looked at the timeline of theft, each red mark representing another month David had stolen from me while playing the caring brother-in-law. 3 years of Claire's doing fine in her little apartment, while he paid for luxury vacations with my money. How long would criminal charges take? 18 months minimum. Civil recovery could be faster, but criminal charges would make sure this follows him forever. I thought about my son, about the family David had charmed for decades, about the choice between justice and family peace. Arrogance creates evidence. Subscribe. Learn when silence becomes your strongest weapon. Harold gathered the documents into neat piles. Take the weekend to decide. But Mrs. Morrison, don't let him know you've discovered this. Men who steal from family members can become desperate when cornered. I nodded and stood to leave. Outside, Charlotte traffic moved normally, people living ordinary lives without forensic accountants or forged signatures. I envied them. My phone buzzed. Text from David: Claire, hope you're having a good week. Just want you to know how proud Mark would be of how strong you've been. I stared at his message, then at Harold's red timeline in my bag. She leaned forward. We have enough to file criminal charges. The question is, do you want justice or just your money back? Justice or money, which would you choose? Tell me why in the comments. David's voice carried across the restaurant. Claire's doing fine in her little apartment. Some people prefer simpler lives. He had no idea I was recording. The family dinner was my son Michael's idea, a chance for everyone to catch up before the holidays. David had driven down from Atlanta with his wife Susan, their teenage kids complaining about missing parties to have dinner with boring adults. I'd driven up from Charlotte with my phone set to record everything. The restaurant was loud enough to mask conversations but quiet enough to capture clear audio. I kept my phone face down beside my water glass, the recording app running silently while David held court about his successful law practice and generous management of family obligations. Have you ever let someone confess to crimes they didn't know you could prove? Claire's been so grateful for my help with Mark's estate, David told the table, cutting his steak with surgical precision. These legal matters can be overwhelming for someone without business experience. I've been handling all the complicated property transfers and tax filings. Susan nodded approvingly. David's always been the family problem solver. Remember when your father needed help with that Medicare issue? Michael smiled at his uncle. Mom's lucky to have you looking out for her, Uncle David. Dad would appreciate knowing she's in good hands. I sipped my wine and let them paint David as the family hero while my phone captured every word. Do you know someone who's built their reputation on helping people they're actually destroying? David leaned toward Michael. The Nevada properties were particularly complex. Your father made some unusual investment choices that required significant legal correction. I've been working with tax attorneys in Las Vegas to clean up those complications. The lie was so smooth, so confident, that even I almost believed it for a moment. David had perfected the art of making theft sound like selfless service. What kind of complications? Michael asked. David waved his hand dismissively. Technical issues with property titles and interstate tax requirements. Nothing your mother needs to worry about. I've restructured everything to minimize her tax burden and simplify management. The problem was that David's simplification meant stealing everything while making me grateful for the theft. I set down my wine glass carefully. David, you've been so thorough with everything. I never even see rental income statements anymore. That's intentional, Claire. I didn't want you stressed about quarterly reports and maintenance issues. The rental income goes directly to estate management fees and property taxes. Much cleaner that way. Michael looked impressed. That's really thoughtful, Uncle David. David smiled across the table at me. Mark always said family takes care of family. I'm just honoring his wishes. My phone was still recording when David's voice dropped confidentially. Between you and me, Michael, those Nevada properties are generating serious income. Your mother's set for life, even if she doesn't realize how well I've structured everything. The admission was perfect, David claiming credit for managing income he'd been stealing, recorded in his own voice with family witnesses. Watch powerful people destroy themselves with their own words. Subscribe, I document every shocking confession. Dinner ended with hugs and promises to get together again soon. David paid the check with a credit card I now knew was funded by my stolen rental income. As we walked to our cars, he squeezed my shoulder with familiar false warmth. Claire, if you ever need anything at all, you just call me. Mark made me promise to take care of you. I smiled back. You've been taking such good care of me, David. I couldn't ask for more. As David signed the check, I stopped recording. 23 minutes of admissions, enough to destroy him. Ever let someone dig their own grave with their mouth? Share that story below. The courthouse clerk stamped my papers at 3:47 p.m. on a Tuesday. By 4:15, David's phone was ringing with questions he couldn't answer. Harold Henderson had spent 2 weeks preparing the legal filing, a civil suit for asset recovery combined with a motion to freeze all accounts connected to Mark's estate. The evidence was overwhelming. Forged signatures, unauthorized transfers, fraudulent court documents, and David's recorded admission of managing income that belonged to me. I'd driven to the Mecklenburg County Courthouse alone, carrying 3 copies of every document in a leather briefcase that had belonged to Mark. The filing fee was $800, money I paid with funds from the Nevada account David didn't know existed. Have you ever filed papers that would destroy someone's whole life? The legal motion was surgical in its precision. It requested immediate freezing of all accounts receiving transfers from Mark's estate, return of all stolen funds with interest, and criminal investigation of the forged documents. Harold had included David's recorded statements as Exhibit A. By 4:30, my lawyer called with news. Claire, David's firm received the filing notice. His senior partner wants to meet tomorrow morning. This is moving fast. David called me at 5:15. His voice was controlled, but I could hear the edge underneath. Claire, I just got some confusing legal papers. There seems to be some misunderstanding about the estate management. Could we meet tonight? I think we can clear this up quickly. Do you trust someone who calls legal theft a misunderstanding? I let silence hang on the phone for 5 seconds, long enough for David to understand that his careful control was slipping. David, I'm sure whatever papers you received are just part of normal legal processes. You understand these things better than I do. Right, but Claire, some of the claims in these documents are concerning. They suggest irregularities that simply don't exist. I think someone may have given you bad advice. The truth was that David's calm was cracking, and his panic was exactly what I'd been waiting 3 years to hear. I'm not sure what you mean, David. I trust you completely to handle anything that needs handling. The phone went quiet except for David's breathing. When he spoke again, his voice was different, sharper, less concerned uncle and more cornered attorney. Claire, we need to discuss this face to face. Tonight. Some allegations in these papers could damage the whole family if they're not addressed immediately. I looked at my reflection in the kitchen window, this woman who'd spent 3 years letting David think she was helpless while she built a case that would end him. Of course, David. Family first. Harold called again at 7 p.m. Claire, David's law firm has requested an emergency meeting with our office tomorrow. They want to address misunderstandings before unnecessary litigation. That's lawyer speak for panic. Financial thieves fold fast when evidence piles up. Subscribe, watch how truth destroys careful lies. David's assistant called twice. Then his lawyer. Then David himself, voice shaking for the first time in 3 years. When someone realizes you're 3 steps ahead. Priceless. Share your gotcha moment below. The hotel lobby felt like neutral territory for a war David was finally realizing he'd already lost. He sat across from me in a leather chair that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent, legal papers spread between us like a peace treaty he'd already broken twice. David's usually perfect hair was slightly disheveled, and his confident smile had been replaced by the expression of a man calculating how much his lies would cost him. Claire, I think we can resolve this whole situation without involving courts or publicity. Family business should stay family business. His lawyer sat beside him, a woman whose expensive suit couldn't hide the fact that she was representing a client who'd lied to her about the basic facts of his case. Every few minutes, she'd glance at the evidence Harold had provided, her expression growing more concerned. Have you ever watched someone realize they underestimated you completely? David leaned forward, his voice taking on the reasonable tone that had fooled me for 3 years. I've been managing those properties as a favor to Mark's memory. The income has been going to estate taxes and management fees, exactly as it should. If there's been any confusion about the accounting, we can certainly clarify that. I opened my folder and slid a bank statement across the table. It showed rental income from the Florida properties being deposited directly into David's personal account, not an estate management account. This shows rental income going to Morrison Legal Services, then immediately transferred to your personal checking account. That doesn't look like estate management fees to me. David's lawyer reviewed the statement. Her pen stopped moving. When lies meet evidence, which one wins? Drop your prediction below. Claire, those transfers were advances against future management fees. Everything was properly documented. But David's voice carried less conviction than it had 5 minutes earlier. I slid another document across the table, the Nevada property statements showing income flowing to my forgotten account for 3 years. David, if you were managing these properties for estate taxes, why didn't you know about the Nevada rental income? $18,000 per month that you never mentioned in any of your reports? His lawyer looked at him sharply. David's face had gone pale. The Nevada properties they had different management structures. I was focusing on the Florida holdings first. The truth was that David's lies were collapsing faster than he could build new ones. I placed the final document on the table, Harold's forensic analysis of the forged signatures. David's lawyer picked it up and read silently, her expression shifting from concern to professional distance. Mr. Morrison, she said quietly, we need to discuss this privately. But I wasn't finished. I pulled out my phone and played 30 seconds of audio from our family dinner, David's voice clearly stating that he'd been managing income that was generating serious money for my benefit. David, this is your voice from last week, talking about managing my income while sitting in a restaurant paid for with money you stole from me. David's hands shook as he reached for his water glass. His lawyer was already packing her briefcase. Arrogance destroys thieves faster than evidence. Subscribe, see how pride becomes their downfall. Claire, I think we can work out a reasonable settlement that addresses everyone's concerns without unnecessary complications. I stood up and gathered my papers. David, I'm sure you'll figure out what's reasonable. You're the lawyer. As I walked toward the hotel exit, I heard his lawyer's voice. Mr. Morrison, I can no longer represent you in this matter. David's face went white when I mentioned the Nevada property managers. You talked to them? I smiled. They called me. Is this enough evidence to destroy a thief? Tell me what you do next. The law firm's senior partner cleared his throat. Mr. Morrison, we cannot represent you in this matter. David had just lost his protection. I wasn't in the room when it happened, but Harold's contact at David's firm called with the details within an hour. The senior partners had reviewed my evidence and decided that representing David would create unacceptable liability exposure for their practice. David Morrison, who'd built his reputation on handling complex estate matters, was now too toxic for his own law firm to defend. Have you ever watched someone's entire support system abandon them in one day? The ripple effect started immediately. Michael called me that afternoon, his voice tight with confusion and anger. Mom, Uncle David just called. He says there's been some kind of misunderstanding about Dad's estate, and that you're suing him. What's going on? I'd been dreading this conversation for weeks. Michael had looked up to David since childhood, had interned at his law firm during college, had trusted him to handle his father's legacy with honor. Michael, your father left me $19 million in property. David has been stealing the rental income for 3 years while telling me the properties were worthless. I have proof. The silence on the phone lasted long enough for me to count my heartbeats. Mom, that's impossible. Uncle David's been helping us. He paid for Dad's funeral. He's been managing everything so you wouldn't have to worry. Do you know someone whose lies were so big that the truth sounded impossible? I could hear Michael's world reshaping itself around information that didn't fit the uncle he thought he knew. Mom, are you sure about this? Maybe there's been some kind of accounting error. Michael, I have bank statements showing David transferring your father's rental income to his personal accounts. I have recordings of him admitting he's been managing income that belongs to me. I have handwriting analysis proving he forged your father's signature on legal documents. Michael's breathing changed. Jesus, Mom. Why didn't you tell me sooner? Because you needed to have a normal wedding and a normal first year of marriage. This fight was mine to fight. The truth was that protecting Michael from David's betrayal had been harder than gathering evidence to stop it. By evening, David's professional network was crumbling. The Florida Bar Association had opened an investigation into the forged documents. The Atlanta Estate Planning Group had suspended his membership pending review. 3 of his firm's major clients had requested new counsel. Harold called with updates every few hours. Claire, David's new lawyer, wants to meet tomorrow. They're talking about a full restitution offer. Janet called from Mark's old office, now cleaned out and ready for new tenants. Claire, David came by today asking if I'd kept any files. He looked terrible, like he hadn't slept in days. He offered me money to sign a statement saying Mark's documents had been unclear about property ownership. What did you tell him? I told him Mark's instructions were the clearest thing about working for him. Then I handed him a box of his personal items and asked him not to come back. Ever seen someone realize their reputation was worth less than toilet paper? Share what happened. David called me at 9 p.m., his voice stripped of all pretense. Claire, we need to talk. Tonight. Just you and me. I looked at my reflection in the dark kitchen window, this woman who'd spent 3 years appearing weak while building a case strong enough to destroy a career built on lies. Of course, David. Where would you like to meet? The ethics board letter arrived at David's office while he was on TV claiming innocence. Predict, will David's desperation make him more dangerous or more careless? Drop your guess. The letter was polished and cold. The rebuttal was sharper and shorter. David's new lawyer had sent a formal response to my lawsuit, 6 pages of legal language that boiled down to Mrs. Morrison is confused about complex estate matters. The letter suggested I was emotionally compromised by grief and influenced by unscrupulous advisors seeking contingency fees. Harold read it aloud in his office, his voice flat with professional disgust. He's claiming you're mentally unstable and that he's been protecting the estate from your poor financial decisions. It's a desperate strategy, but it could work if a judge believes grief affects judgment. I pulled out my phone and played David's restaurant recording where he bragged about generating serious income from properties he claimed were worthless. Harold, does David sound like he's protecting me from poor decisions, or does he sound like someone who's been stealing from me for 3 years? Ever been called crazy by someone who was actually the problem? How did you prove them wrong? Harold smiled grimly and opened his laptop. Let's draft our response. The rebuttal was 3 pages that destroyed David's defense point by point. We included bank records showing systematic theft, handwriting analysis proving forgery, property manager statements confirming my ownership, and audio recordings of David's admissions. But the final paragraph was my favorite. Mrs. Morrison's mental state is demonstrated by her methodical 3-year investigation that uncovered defendant's sophisticated theft operation. Her emotional stability is evidenced by her restraint in pursuing civil rather than criminal remedies, despite overwhelming evidence of felony fraud. The truth was that grief had made me smarter, not weaker, and David's lies had made him careless. We filed the rebuttal on Friday afternoon. By Monday morning, David's new lawyer had withdrawn from the case. Susan called me Tuesday evening, her voice shaking. "Claire, David told me about the lawsuit. Is it true? Did he really steal from you?" I'd been wondering when David's wife would learn the truth. Susan had always been kind to me, had genuinely cared about my well-being after Mark died. Discovering that her husband was a thief would destroy her trust in everything. "Susan, I have bank records showing David transferred $19 million of rental income from my properties to his personal accounts. I have recordings of him admitting he's been managing my money. The handwriting experts say he forged Mark's signature on multiple documents." Susan was quiet for so long I thought the call had dropped. "Claire, I had no idea. David told me Mark's estate was barely covering taxes and legal fees. He said you were living simply by choice. When someone's lies collapse, innocent people get buried in the rubble. Subscribe, see how truth destroys more than just the guilty." The conversation lasted an hour. Susan cried twice, once when she realized David had been lying to her about everything, and again when she understood that her comfortable lifestyle had been funded by stolen money. "Claire, what can I do? How can I help fix this?" "Susan, just make sure David knows that his family understands the truth now. Sometimes that's the only justice that really matters." I hung up and sat in my quiet apartment, thinking about how betrayal spreads like infection through families. David hadn't just stolen from me, he'd turned his wife into an unknowing accomplice and his children into beneficiaries of theft. My lawyer called Wednesday morning with news that made my coffee taste better. "Claire, David wants to settle. Full restitution plus punitive damages. He'll sign a confession statement and surrender his law license to avoid criminal prosecution. Forensic comparison, approved. Criminal charges, pending David's cooperation. Ever been told to back down, and didn't? Share what happened next?" She said, "With your grace." I slid the envelope to the first hand. David's settlement offer arrived on elegant letterhead from a law firm I'd never heard of, his fourth legal representation in 2 weeks. The number at the bottom made my hands tremble. $24 million, full restitution plus damages, paid over 6 months to accommodate liquidity concerns. Harold spread the settlement documents across his conference table like evidence of David's complete surrender. "Claire, this is more than we asked for. He's offering $5 million above actual damages. That suggests he's hiding assets we haven't found yet. Have you ever gotten an apology worth more than the original theft?" The settlement meeting was scheduled for Thursday morning at a downtown law office neither side had connections to. Neutral ground for David's professional execution. I wore the black dress I'd bought for Mark's funeral, appropriate for another kind of ending. David arrived 15 minutes late, flanked by his new lawyer and a financial advisor whose job was apparently to make theft sound like accounting errors. His usual confidence had been replaced by the careful movements of someone who knew every word could be used against him. "Claire, I want to start by saying that any confusion about estate management was never intentional. Mark's wishes were sometimes unclear, and I made judgment calls that may have appeared to benefit me personally." I sat quietly and let David perform his rehearsed apology while Harold took notes. "Do you accept explanations that sound like admissions of guilt?" The settlement terms were comprehensive: full return of all stolen rental income, transfer of all properties back to my name, payment of my legal fees, and David's resignation from any role in Mark's charitable foundation. But the most satisfying clause was the one David hadn't expected: a written confession that would be filed with the Florida Bar Association. "David, signing this document means admitting you stole from your brother's widow while she grieved. It means your law license gets suspended. It means your clients learn you're a thief. Are you prepared for those consequences?" David's financial advisor whispered something urgent in his ear. David nodded slowly. "The alternative is criminal prosecution, which would mean jail time and asset forfeiture. Yes, I'll sign. The problem was that David had finally run out of people to lie to, including himself. I watched David sign his name to documents that ended his legal career and restored my financial security. His signature was steady, but his hands shook between pages. Harold leaned toward me. Claire, the funds will be transferred within 72 hours. The properties will be back in your name by Friday. As David slid the signed confession across the table, I pulled an envelope from my purse, the same envelope I'd carried to his hotel meeting, to the courthouse, to every legal appointment for 2 months. David, this is for you. He opened it carefully. Inside was a single sheet of paper. His resignation letter from Mark's charitable foundation, written in Mark's handwriting and dated a week before Mark died. David's voice was barely audible. How did you? Mark wrote that letter after he discovered you'd been skimming money from the foundation's rental properties. He never sent it because he died first. But he wanted me to have it, just in case you ever tried to steal from me too. Silent strength defeats loud lies every time. Subscribe for more stories of quiet victories. Vote postponed. Third-party review, requested in a whisper. Strongest move in the room was silence. Agree? Drop your thoughts below. No confession. Just a statement about protecting the institution. David's resignation from Mark's foundation arrived in my email at 6 a.m. on Monday, 2 days after our settlement meeting. The statement was brief, professional, and carefully worded to avoid admitting guilt while acknowledging the need to step away from responsibilities that might create appearance of conflict. Susan called an hour later, her voice hollow. Claire, David moved out yesterday. He's staying at his brother's house in Savannah while he figures out what comes next. Have you ever watched someone's life collapse because they couldn't stop lying? The resignation statement was forwarded to every foundation board member, every client of David's firm, and every family member who'd been charmed by his performance of competence and care. Within hours, David Morrison went from respected estate attorney to cautionary tale about family betrayal. Michael called that afternoon. Mom, Uncle David's resignation letter is all over Facebook. People are asking what happened. What should I tell them? Tell them the truth, Michael. Your father trusted his brother to protect his family, and David chose to steal from us instead. When lies collapse publicly, truth doesn't need to shout. Subscribe, watch how silence speaks louder than noise. The foundation's interim director, Patricia Wells, reached out personally to thank me for exposing David's financial irregularities. Mrs. Morrison, your husband would be proud of how you protected his charitable legacy. David had been redirecting foundation rental income to cover his personal legal expenses for months. Even Mark's foundation had been feeding David's theft operation. Harold's office called with final numbers, $24 million transferred to my accounts, all properties returned to my legal name, David's law license suspended pending further Bar Association review. The 3-year theft operation had been completely reversed in less than 6 weeks. Do you choose public vindication or private peace when someone destroys your trust? I drove to Mark's grave that evening, the first time I'd visited since David's theft had been exposed. The headstone looked the same, but I felt different standing there, no longer the confused widow David had counted on remaining silent forever. Mark, David's gone. The properties are mine again. The foundation is clean. You can rest now. The wind moved through the cemetery trees, and for a moment I could almost hear Mark's voice telling me he'd known I was strong enough to fight his brother and win. Janet called as I drove home. Claire, I got a call from the new foundation director. They want to hire me back to help clean up David's financial records. Apparently, he kept 2 sets of books for everything. Truth wins when you document everything. Subscribe, learn to build cases that can't be broken. The settlement money would arrive tomorrow. The properties would generate income under my name again. David would spend years rebuilding a reputation destroyed by his own greed. But tonight, driving through Charlotte traffic toward my small apartment, I wasn't thinking about money or property or legal victories. I was thinking about Mark's handwriting on that yellow legal paper, keep David away from these accounts. Even facing death, Mark had been trying to protect me from his own brother. A single line in a private note: "You were right to protect what mattered. Pursue damages, or choose closure. What would you do next?" The plaque had weathered, the promise hadn't. 6 months after David's settlement, I stood in Mark's memorial garden at the Naples house, our house, watching early spring flowers push through winter soil. The garden looked exactly as Mark had designed it, except now the bronze plaque bore the truth: "In memory of Mark Morrison, beloved husband and father, whose generosity continues through the foundation he built and the family he protected." David's name had been removed from the plaque, along with his access to everything Mark had built. Have you ever returned to a place that someone else stole from you? How did it feel to take it back? Michael and his wife Sarah had driven down from Miami for the weekend, their first visit to the house since learning about David's theft. Michael walked through the rooms quietly, touching furniture and photographs like he was meeting his father's memory again for the first time. "Mom, I keep thinking about all those family dinners where Uncle David talked about taking care of you. How did you sit there and listen to that?" I was arranging fresh flowers in the vase Mark had bought for our anniversary, the same vase David's wife had admired during visits when she thought their wealth came from David's legal success. "Michael, anger without evidence is just noise. I needed proof that would end David's theft completely, not just stop it temporarily." Sarah looked up from the photo albums she'd been browsing. "Mrs. Morrison, how did you know David would eventually confess if you stayed quiet long enough? Do you know someone whose patience became their most powerful weapon?" The truth was more complex than strategy. Mark had taught me that desperate people make mistakes, and David's greed would eventually expose his lies. But watching David charm our family while stealing from me had required a kind of strength I didn't know I possessed. David needed to feel safe to get careless. If I'd confronted him early, he would have hidden evidence and crafted better lies. By staying quiet, I let him think I was helpless while I built a case he couldn't escape. Michael sat down beside me on the couch where Mark used to read Sunday newspapers. "Mom, why didn't you tell me what was happening?" "I could have helped. Because you needed to love your uncle until you had proof he didn't deserve it. Children shouldn't learn about family betrayal from rumors, they should learn from evidence. What would you preserve for a future you may never see?" We spent the afternoon going through Mark's office, now restored to its original organization after David's attempts to simplify the business records. In Mark's desk drawer, behind old tax returns and insurance policies, Sarah found something none of us had seen before: a sealed envelope marked "Michael, for your first house." Inside were property deeds for a small condo in Orlando and a check for $50,000, dated the week before Mark died. "Your father wanted you to have your own place when you were ready," I explained. "David never told you about it because the condo was generating rental income he was stealing." Michael's eyes filled with tears, not from sadness, but from understanding how thoroughly his father had tried to protect everyone he loved, even from his own brother. "The most powerful inheritance isn't money, it's proof that someone believed you were worth protecting." As evening approached, we sat on the back patio where Mark and I had planned to grow old together. The fountain he'd installed still ran clear water over smooth stones, and the orange trees were heavy with fruit we'd never gotten to pick together. "Mom," Michael said quietly, "I'm proud of how you handled this. Dad would be too." I looked at my son and his wife, this new family Mark would never meet but had protected anyway through careful planning and handwritten warnings about his own brother. A sealed envelope tucked behind an old ledger, older, clearer intent. "What would you preserve for a future you may never see? Share your answer below." They didn't applaud loudly. They nodded like people who finally understood. The Nevada villa keys felt warm in my palm as I stood on the balcony Mark designed for me. No cameras, no interviews, just the sunset we'd planned to watch together. 8 months had passed since David's settlement, and life had found its rhythm again. The properties generated income under my name. Mark's foundation operated with clean books and new leadership. David had moved to South Carolina and taken a job with a small firm that specialized in real estate closings, a long fall from the estate planning empire he'd built on stolen money. Have you ever stood in a place someone tried to take from you and felt peace instead of anger? Michael visited every few weeks, sometimes bringing Sarah, sometimes coming alone to sit in Mark's office and read the business journals his father had collected. The Orlando condo had become their weekend retreat, generating enough rental income during the week to pay its own taxes and maintenance. "Mom, do you ever miss the fight?" Michael asked during his last visit, as we walked through the memorial garden where Mark's plaque now told the complete truth. "I miss your father. But I don't miss wondering if David was stealing from us." The question surprised me because I hadn't thought about David in weeks. The settlement money had been invested conservatively, the way Mark would have wanted. The properties were professionally managed by people who sent me monthly reports and asked permission before making any changes. Do you hold on to anger that served its purpose, or do you let it go when justice is done? Janet had taken the job as foundation administrator, bringing the same careful attention to Mark's charity that she'd brought to his business. She called occasionally with updates about programs funded by the rental income David had been stealing, scholarships for kids whose parents couldn't afford college, medical equipment for rural hospitals, small business loans for entrepreneurs starting over after bankruptcy. Mrs. Morrison, the foundation helped 32 families this quarter. The Naples property rental income alone covered all our administrative costs. Mark's generosity was finally reaching the people he'd intended to help, instead of funding David's children's private school tuition. Silent strength defeats loud lies every time. Subscribe for more stories of quiet victories. I'd kept one thing from David's settlement, the recording of his restaurant confession. Not for legal purposes, the case was closed, but as a reminder that people reveal their true character when they think no one important is listening. Sometimes I played it back and marveled at how confident David had sounded while describing theft as family service. Other times I deleted it and then restored it from backup, unsure whether holding on to proof of betrayal was wisdom or poison. If this story moved you, hit subscribe and tell someone who needs to hear it. The sunset painted the Nevada mountains purple and gold, the same colors Mark had pointed out during our last trip here together. He'd stood on this same balcony, his arm around my waist, talking about retirement plans that death had interrupted but hadn't destroyed. "Claire, when I'm gone, you'll know exactly what to do with all this," he'd said, gesturing toward the city lights below. "You're stronger than you think, and smarter than I ever gave you credit for." David had counted on my grief lasting forever. But grief, like theft, eventually runs out of things to feed on. I pulled out my phone and deleted David's restaurant recording permanently this time. The evidence had served its purpose. The money was returned. The properties were mine. David's reputation would never recover. Mark's voice lived in the careful way he'd organized our life to protect me from dangers I'd been too trusting to imagine. David's voice would fade into the silence he deserved. The property deed in my hand bore my name in Mark's careful script. No amendments. No corrections. Just truth that time couldn't erase. What's the most powerful lesson from Claire's journey? Share the line you'll remember most.